Ah, welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot and let me tell you a story. But first, please, subscribe, like and share, and make sure your notification bell is clicked for future stories. The following stories were written by Hereward Carrington and noted as either true or having witnessed accounts. Their truth, again, is up to you. How a Ghost Warned the King. Kings and queens are not exempt from visitations of the supernatural. Indeed, a large number of royal dignitaries have seen ghosts and have been haunted by specters in an unpleasant a manner as any ordinary mortal. Were we to hunt through the pages of history, we should find many of these, some of which it will doubtless be of interest to give at some future time. The following account is taken from the annals of the Kingdom of Scotland, and is told in queer old English, so the long S's and so on, making it very hard to read in the original. I interpret it into modern English as best I can, maintaining its form. While James IV stayed at Linlithgow to gather up the scattered remains of his army, which had been defeated by the Earl of Surrey at Flodden Field, he went into a church of St. Michael there to hear the evening prayer. While he was at his devotion, a remarkable figure of an ancient man with flowing amber-colored hair hanging over his shoulders, his forehead high and inclining to baldness, his garments of a fine blue color, somewhat long and girded together, with a fine white cloth of comely and very reverent aspect, was seen inquiring for the king. When his majesty, being pointed out to him, he made his way through the crowd till he came to him, and then, with a clown's simplicity, leaning over the canon's feet, he addressed him in the following words: "Sir, I am sent hither to entreat you to delay your intended expedition for this time, and proceed no further, for if you do, you will be unfortunate and not prosper in your enterprise, nor any of your followers. I am further charged to warn you not to follow the acquaintance, company, or counsel of women, as you value your life, honor, and estate." After giving him this admonition, he withdrew himself back through the crowd and disappeared. When the service was ended, the king inquired earnestly after him, but he could not be found or heard anywhere, neither could any of the bystanders, of whom many narrowly watched him, resolving afterwards to have discoursed with him, feel or perceive how, when, or where he passed from them, having in a manner vanished from their sight. This caused the king to feel some uneasiness, for he said if he were mortal man, how did he go so quickly hence? And how did he give me such advice, which I, of all men, know at this time to be of value? The king was sorely puzzled, and called the warden of the church to him, and questioned him as to the man whom he had seen. And when the warden had heard the tale from the king, he questioned him in turn as to the man's appearance, whether he was this and that, and of the man's manner of speech. And when the king had answered to his satisfaction, he turned pale and said, "O king, the personage whom you saw today was no mortal man, but one dead, long ago, one who lived and died close here, and known to many of us well. He has been known to come to us before in times of great stress, and his advice has always been good. Truly, my lord, you have this day seen an apparition of a dead man." And the king marveled at what he had seen. Thus ends the curious old narrative. It will be seen that several others saw the ghost besides the king. These are called collective cases by those engaged in physical studies, for the reason that several persons saw the figure at the same time or collectively. Such cases have never been satisfactorily explained, for if the phantom were a mere hallucination, as many claim, how did several see it at once? The stains of blood. The following narrative was personally related to Robert Dale Owen by a clergyman of the Church of England who was chaplain at the time to the British legation in Florence. It is as follows. In the year 1856, I was staying with my wife and children at a favorite watering place. In order to attend to some affairs of my own, I determined to leave my family there for 3 or 4 days. Accordingly, on the 8th of August, I took the railway and arrived that evening, an unexpected guest at the Hall, the residence of a gentleman whose acquaintance I had recently made, and with whom my sister was then staying. I arrived late, soon afterwards went to bed, and before long fell asleep. Awaking after 3 or 4 hours, I was not surprised to find that I could sleep no more, for I never rest well in a strange bed. After trying, therefore, in vain to induce sleep, I began to arrange my plans for the day. I had been engaged some little time in this way when I became suddenly sensitive to the fact that there was a light in the room. Turning around, I distinctly perceived a female figure, and what attracted my special attention was that the light by which I saw it emanated from itself. I watched the figure attentively. The features were not perceptible. After moving a little distance, it disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. My first thoughts were that it was some sort of trick. I immediately got out of bed, struck a light, and found my bedroom door still locked. I then carefully examined the walls to ascertain if there was any other concealed means of entrance or exit, but none could I find. I drew the curtains and opened the shutters, but all outside was silent and dark, there being no moonlight. After examining the room in every part, I went back to bed and began thinking calmly over the whole matter. What had I seen, and why did it appear? In the morning, as soon as I was up and dressed, I told my sister what I had seen. She then informed me that the house had the reputation of being haunted, and that a murder had been committed in it, but not in the room in which I had slept. Later in the day, I left after making my sister promise to do all that she could to unravel the mystery. On the following Wednesday morning, I received a letter from my sister in which she informed me that since I left, she'd had inquiries and had ascertained that the murder was committed in the very room in which I slept. She added that she proposed visiting us the next day, and that she would like me to write out an account of what I had seen, together with a plan of the room, and that on that plan she wished me to mark the place of the appearance and disappearance of the figure. This I immediately did, and the next day when my sister arrived, she asked me if I had complied with her request. I replied, pointing to the drawing-room table, "Yes, there is the account and the plan." As she rose to examine it, I prevented her, saying, "Do not look at it until you have told me all that you have to say, because you might unintentionally color your story by what you may read there." Thereupon, she informed me that she had the carpet taken up in the room I had occupied, and that the marks of blood from the murdered person were there, plainly visible on a particular part of the floor. At my request, she also then drew a plan of the room, and marked upon it the spot which still bore traces of blood. The two plans, my sister's and mine, were now compared, and we verified the most remarkable fact, that the place she had marked as the beginning and ending of the traces of blood coincided exactly with the spots marked on my plan as those on which the female figure had appeared and disappeared. Face to face. The following case is recorded by the wife of Colonel Lewin and is reported in the Proceedings of the SPR. In January 1868, I took a house close to Hastings. One night, there was a heavy storm. The weather was bitterly cold, and a fire was burning in my bedroom when I went to bed at 10:30. I tried to go to sleep, but it was no use. The noise of the wind and the rain kept me awake. I must have been lying like this for a couple of hours when I became conscious of what seemed like a light in the room. I thought the fire must have rekindled itself, and I crawled along on my knees on the bed to look at the fire over the high wooden foot to see how this might be. I had no thought of anything but the fire, and was not nervous in the slightest degree. As I raised myself up on my knees and looked over the foot of the bed, I found myself face to face at a distance of about 3 feet with the semblance of a man. I never once for a moment thought he was a man, but was struck with the feeling that this was one from the dead. The light seemed to emanate from around his figure, but the only portions which I saw clearly were the head and shoulders. The face, I shall never forget. It was pale, emaciated, with a thin, high-bridged nose and eyes deeply sunk and glowing in the sockets with a sort of glare. A long beard was seemingly rolled in under a white comforter, and on the head was a slouched felt hat. I had a nervous shock and felt a dead person was looking upon me, a living one, but had no sensation of being actually frightened until the figure moved slowly as if interposing between me and the door. Then horror overcame me and I fell back in a dead faint. How long I remained unconscious, I know not, but I came to myself cold and cramped. The room was quite dark and nothing was visible. Thoroughly tired out, I got into bed and slept soundly until morning. Julia, darling. This account reads in part: My mother died on the 24th of June, 1874, at Slima, Malta, where we were residing for her health. Several nights later, she appeared to me. I seemed to have been sleeping some time when I woke, and turning over on the other side towards the window, saw my mother standing by my bedside, crying and wringing her hands. I had not been awake long enough to remember that she was dead, and exclaimed quite naturally, "Why, dear, what's the matter?" And then suddenly remembering, I screamed. The nurse sprang up from the next room, but on top of the step, flung herself on her knees and began to turn her beads and cry. My father, at the same time, arrived at the opposite door, and I had heard his sudden exclamation of, "Julia, darling!" My mother turned towards him, and then to me, and then wringing her hands again, retreated toward the nursery and was lost. The nurse afterwards stated that she distinctly felt something pass her. My father ordered her out of the room, and telling me that I had only been dreaming, stayed until I fell asleep. The next day, however, he told me that he too had seen the vision, and that he hoped to do so again, and that if she ever came to see me, I was not to be frightened. But she never appeared again. The cut across the cheek. In the narrative which follows, the apparition conveyed by its very appearance information which the percipient could not possibly have known. It is from Mr. H.W. Walton of Dent, Sudbury, England, and was sent to Mr. Stead, who published it. In the month of April 1881, I was located in Norfolk, and my duties took me once a fortnight to a fishing village on the coast, so I can guarantee the following facts. It is customary for the fishing smacks to go to Grimsby, line fishing, in the spring. The vessel started one afternoon on their journey north. In the evening, a heavy northeast wind blew, and one of the boats mistook the white surf on the rocks for the reflection of a lighthouse. In consequence, the boat got into shallow water. A heavy sea came and swept 2 men from the deck. One man grasped a rope and was saved. The other, a younger man, failed to save himself, though an expert swimmer. It was said that he was heard to shout about 11 o'clock. Toward 1 o'clock, the young man's mother, lying awake, saw his apparition come to the foot of the bed, clad in white, and she screamed with fright and told her husband what she had seen and that Jay was drowned. He sought in vain to calm her by saying that she must have been dreaming. She asserted the contrary. The next day, when her daughter came in with the telegram of the sad event, before her daughter had time to speak, she cried out, "Jay is drowned," and became unconscious. She remained in that state for many hours. When she regained consciousness, she told them particularly and distinctly what she had seen. And the remarkable thing is, she said, if ever the body is found, it has a cut across its cheek, specifying which cheek it was. The body was found some days after, and exactly as Mother had seen it, was the cut on the cheek. The following account was sent to the SPR. Ghosts are usually seen. They are sometimes heard. They are very rarely felt. The account which follows is an example of the latter class in which the ghost was not only seen, but touched. After stating that she was visiting a friend of hers in the country when the event occurred, the narrator proceeds. We went upstairs together, I being perhaps a couple of steps behind my friend. When on reaching the topmost step, I felt something suddenly slip behind me from an unoccupied room on the left of the stairs. Thinking it must be imagination, no one being in the house except the widow and servant who occupied rooms on another landing, I did not speak to my friend, who turned off to a room on the right, but walked quickly into my room, which faced the staircase, still feeling as though a tall figure was bending over me. I turned on the gas, struck a light, and was in the act of applying it, when I felt a heavy grasp on my arm of a hand, minus the middle finger. Upon this, I uttered a loud cry, which brought my friend, the widow lady, and the servant girl into the room to inquire in the case of my alarm. The two latter turned very pale on hearing the story. The house was thoroughly searched, but nothing was discovered. Some weeks passed, and I had ceased to be alarmed at the occurrence when I chanced to mention it while spending the afternoon with some friends. A gentleman asked me if I had ever heard a description or seen a cart of the lady's late husband. On receiving a reply in the negative, he said, singularly enough, he was tall, had a slight stoop, and had lost the middle finger on his hand. On my return, I inquired of the servant who had been in the family from childhood if there was such a case, and learned that it was quite correct, and that she, the girl, had once, when sleeping in the same room, awakened on feeling someone pressing down on her knees, and, on opening her eyes, saw her late master by the side of the bed, on which she fainted and never dared to enter the room after dark since. She is not an imaginative girl, nor am I. When I grasped, however, I didn't see anything, but worse was to follow. It so chanced that I had to sleep in that room once again, as the house was full of company, and there was nowhere else for me to go. I had by this time got over my fears, and hardly minded the idea of sleeping in the room at all. I left the room door open, turned out the light, and was soon asleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I awoke with an indescribable feeling. I was suddenly wide awake, without the slightest traces of sleep, yet I did not know how I woke, and had not any recollection of waking. But there I was, wide awake, and staring up at the ceiling with wide open eyes. My right hand was hanging over the side of the bed, so that it fell outwards into the room. Imagine my horror when I then felt a hand suddenly grasp my hand, and I felt distinctly that it was minus the middle finger. The hand was icy cold and of a peculiar hardness. I hung on to the hand, however, determined to get to the bottom of the affair. I gripped tightly and still retained the hand in my grip. Bending over, I stretched out my left hand, and with the fingers of that hand, felt over the hand and wrist I was holding. I then commenced to trace it up the arm. I had but reached about the elbow or a little below when the arm suddenly ended, came to nothing. It was no more. Yet the hand in mine was as solid as ever. This gave me such a shock that I let go of the hand I was holding and sank back into my pillow. The terror took possession of me, and I do not know what happened later. I only know that I had brain fever, which laid me low for several weeks. The occurrence has never been explained. The apparition of the radiant boy. The following is a famous case, well known as the apparition of the radiant boy. It was seen by the Marquis of Londonderry, and frequently spoken of by him afterwards. At the time of the appearance, Lord Londonderry was on a visit to a friend in the north of Ireland. The apartment assigned to him was one calculated to foster the belief in ghosts because of its richly carved paneling, its huge fireplace, looking like the open entrance to a tomb, and the vast, ponderous draperies that hung in thick folds around the room. Lord Londonderry examined his chamber. He made himself acquainted with the forms and faces of the ancient possessors of the mansion, whose portraits hung around the room. Then, after dismissing his valet, he retired to bed. His candles had not long been extinguished when he perceived a light gleaming on the draperies of the lofty canopy over his head. Conscious that there was no fire in the grate and that the curtains were closed, that the chamber had been in perfect darkness but a few minutes before, he supposed that some intruder must have accidentally entered his apartment, and, turning hastily round to the side from which the light proceeded, saw to his infinite astonishment not the form of a human visitor, but the figure of a fair boy who seemed to be garmented in rays of mild and tempered glory, which beamed palely from his slender form like the faint light of the declining moon, and rendered the objects nearest to him dimly and indistinctly visible. The spirit stood but a short distance from the side of the bed. Certain that his own faculties were not deceiving him, Lord Londonderry got up and moved towards the figure. It retreated before him as he slowly advanced, and with equal pace slowly retired. It entered the gloomy arch of the capacious chimney, and then sank into the earth. Lord Londonderry returned to his bed, but not to rest. His mind was harassed by the consideration of the extraordinary event which had just occurred to him. Was it real? Was it the work of imagination? Was it the result of an impostor? It was all incomprehensible. He resolved in the morning not to mention the appearance till he should have well observed the manners and countenance of the family. He was conscious that any deception had been practiced, its authors would be too delighted with their success to conceal the vanity of their triumph. When the guests assembled at breakfast, the eye of Lord Londonderry searched in vain for latent smiles, those conscious looks, that silent communication between the parties by which the authors of such domestic conspiracies are generally betrayed. Everything apparently proceeded in its ordinary course. At last, the hero of the tale felt bound to mention the occurrence of the night. At its conclusion, the host said, "The circumstances which you have just recounted appear very extraordinary to those who have not long been intimates of my dwellings, and are not conversant with the legends of my family. And to those who are, the event which has happened will only serve as a corroboration of an old tradition, that has long been related of by this apartment in which you slept. You have seen the radiant boy. Be content. It is an omen of prosperous fortunes. I would rather that this subject should not be mentioned. And hereafter, the affair ended. Fisher's ghost. The following incident comes from Australia and is well known in that part of the world. It is usually known as Fisher's ghost and is to the following effect. A number of years ago, a free settler named John Fisher, who had long successfully cultivated a grant of land in a remote district, who was known to be possessed of a considerable sum of money, had been missing for some time after having visited the nearest market town, where he had been in the habit of repairing with cattle and produce for sale. An inquiry was instituted by his acquaintances, but his head servant, or rather his assistant on the farm, an ex-convict who had lived many years with him in that situation, declared that his master had left the colony for some time on business, and that he expected him to return in a few months. As this man was generally known as Fisher's confidential servant, his assertion was believed, though some expressed surprise at the settler's abrupt and clandestine departure, for his character was good in every way. The month's wonder soon subsided, however, and Fisher was forgotten. His assistant, meanwhile, managed the farm, bought and sold, and spent money freely. If questioned, which was but rarely, he would express his surprise at his master's delay and pretend to expect him daily. A few months after he had been first missed, a neighboring settler who was returning late on Saturday night from the market town had occasion to pass within a half a mile of Fisher's house. As he was riding by the fence which separated the farm from the high ground, he distinctly saw the figure of a man seated on the railing, and at once recognized the form as the features of his lost neighbor. He instantly stopped and called to him by name, but the figure descended from the railing and, pointing appealingly toward the house, walked slowly across the field in that direction. The settler, having lost sight of him in the gloom, proceeded on his journey and informed his family and neighbors that he had seen Fisher and spoken to him. On inquiry, however, Fisher's assistant said that he had not arrived and affected to laugh at the settler's story, insinuating that he had probably drunk too freely at the market. The neighbors were, however, not satisfied. The strange appearance of Fisher sitting on the railing and pointing with so much meaning towards his own house aroused their suspicions, and they insisted upon a strict and immediate investigation by the police. The party of investigators took with them an old and clever native. They had not proceeded far into the underbrush when they discovered a log on which was a dark brown stain. This the native examined, and at once declared it to be white man's blood. He then, without hesitation, set off at a full run toward a pond not far from the house. He ran backwards and forwards about the pond like a dog on the scent, and finally, borrowing a ramrod from one of the settlers, ran it into the earth. He did this in one or two places and finally said, "White man here." The spot was immediately dug up and a corpse, identified as that of Fisher, was discovered, its skull fractured and evidently many weeks buried. The guilty assistant was immediately arrested and tried at Sydney on circumstantial evidence alone, strong enough, however, to convict him in spite of his self-possession and protestations of innocence. He was sentenced to death, and previous to his execution, made an ample confession of his guilt. If you like these stories, please subscribe, like, and share. Make sure to hit that notification bell for stories in the future. And thank you for listening. The end.